I'd like to begin with a question. Hands up if you know what the save icon is. Now hands up if you know what a floppy disk is. I expect far fewer hands on the second one. The floppy disk is the save icon, but we're long past using them in computers, and yet the symbol has endured, far changed from its original meaning. Leave a comment if you've used a floppy disk before, that will definitely be a fun read. Fascism is like our floppy disk save icon. It started in one place, had a meaning, but over time has taken on new forms and new meanings. Or has it? Well, according to Arch Warhammer, fascism doesn't have a new meaning, as you might believe. In fact, he believes, going so far, that something like the Imperium of Man isn't fascist. And so, this video explores that idea and looks at why he's wrong. I've also included a handy timestamp list so you can follow along the arguments as he brings them up. Luckily, by the grace of the God Emperor, this video is actually shorter than his, which is linked in the description. When looking at the Imperium of Man, and 40k in general, one thing becomes quite apparent. The creators draw heavily from history and popular media to define the aesthetics of the Imperium. Games Workshop didn't just draw from the history well, they drained the well and churned it in a blender to make a sci-fi smoothie that is the Imperium. For example, you can see this World War II era Soviet soldier. When you look at him, it probably drums up some associations: determination against odds, human wave tactics, a persistent lack of equipment, and possibly a love for vodka. Now look at this picture of a Valhallan ice warrior, one of the many regiments in the Imperial Army, and, incidentally, the first one created by Games Workshop. The similarities are painfully obvious, and it should then be clear just how much Games Workshop borrowed when they did their design. What about this? Here is a picture of John Rambo, one of the defining action star of the 80s. The Rambo movies, as violent as they are meant to evoke the machismo of their era, just after the time when America was embroiled in the bloody fields of Vietnam. It evokes a sense of manliness, but also primal savagery. Now here's a picture of another Guard regiment, this time the Katachan Jungle Warriors. Notice the similarities? Well, it should be obvious that because so much of Games Workshop's aesthetics for their game are derived from real-world history, those aesthetics also carry with them historical connotations and baggage. Media isn't in a vacuum, and drawing this much inspiration over so many years cements certain associations in the mind of the audience. So in Argument 1, Arch Warhammer suggests that one of the reasons the Imperium is called fascist is because it has aesthetics that are associated with fascism, but that this association is incorrect, because the symbols are not unique to fascism. He brings up the Death's Head, or Totenkopf, the double-headed imperial eagle, or Aquila, and the Gothic architecture commonly shown on imperial planets, but also, perhaps fittingly, on imperial warships. Firstly, one of the most important characteristics of fascism is its aesthetics. In some ways, fascism is only aesthetics, because the fascists don't really have a solid or well-defined set of beliefs. They are principally concerned with power and returning to some imagined glorious past. In real life, the fascist nations of Italy, Germany, and Japan drew very heavily from their historical pasts to recreate their nations as they saw fit. For the Italians, this was recreating and drawing upon ancient Rome. For the Germans, it was the mythologized past of the Aryan race. And for Japan, it was their feudal time before their nation was humiliated by Western powers. They went to these places because they felt that the past represented a time when they were stronger, as opposed to the present when they were weak. So the question is then, why does the Imperium of Man have the aesthetics that they do? What's the purpose? Well, for the fascist regimes in real life, their iconography was chosen for the purposes of demonstrating strength, and if we look at the Imperium's general aesthetics, we see that this is also their purpose. Symbols like skulls, fists, crosses, and weapons litter the pages of the Imperium's lore and art. These aesthetics are chosen specifically because, like with the real-world fascists, they evoked feelings of strength, power, fear, and dread, mixed in with a good dose of religious zealotry of all things. And it's certainly effective. Who can not look upon the Imperium and get an immediate sense of its weighty power? The Imperium is certainly not about gumdrops and tea time, that's for sure. Arch Warhammer makes the argument then that because these symbols, like the Death's Head or Eagle, were widely used, that they don't represent fascism, since multiple places and people can claim to have used them. It might be true that the symbols weren't unique to fascist or made up by them, but fascists definitely adopted these symbols and worked very hard to propagate their use and association. Infamy has a lot of influence in how society perceives history. It should come as no surprise then that to modern people the symbols of fascism are so widely known, given the scale of the fascist crimes and their impact on the world. The second part of this is the deathcore of Krieg. Arch Warhammer argues that people misconstrue the deathcore as fascist, and so erroneously leap to the wider Imperium being fascist too, based purely on their aesthetics, specifically their name, the word Krieg is German for war, and the use of Stahlhelms, which Arch says date to 1916, pre-fascist Germany. Well, the Wehrmacht continued to use Stahlhelms well into World War II, and it even became something of an iconic look for them, so Arch Warhammer is wrong to assume that just because a symbol started in one place, that time and circumstances can't bring it to another. Here are some pictures of the deathcore of Krieg. When you look at these, what do you feel? I imagine it's some combination of fear and awe. These soldiers are almost alien to look upon, with their gas masks and dull, colorless appearance. Their officers, too, also look very much like SS officers, but generally they all look horrifying, at least to me. Now imagine what kind of planet they're from. Well, in the lore, the deathcore of Krieg comes from a toxic, bombed-out wasteland of a planet that almost destroyed itself in a civil war, over loyalty to the Imperium. The people who live there are obsessed with the idea of sacrifice, and are determined to live only to die for the Emperor. Their lives are short, brutal, and wholly directed towards the violence that the Imperium demands. We've already established that Games Workshop borrows heavily from history, and it should be apparent then that the deathcore are meant to evoke the most brutal and dehumanizing part of industrial warfare, both from World War I and World War II, specifically from the German perspective of the war. Given what we know the fascists wanted to do in the world, Krieg is meant to give us the ultimate realization of this idea, a planet where everything and everyone is dedicated to a cult of violence in the name of the state, and its ruler, the Emperor of Man. One of the flaws of drawing so heavily from history and existing media for creating a setting is that you cannot easily escape the baggage that comes with it. The Imperium cannot simply escape that its aesthetics are, especially to modern people, heavily associated with fascism. You can't marvel at the aesthetics of the Imperium of Man while also ignoring what those aesthetics mean, and where they come from, and their context. Therefore, the Imperium cannot adopt the aesthetics of fascism while also pretending that it isn't fascist. It should be obvious that Argument 2 is Arch Warhammer's central thesis, and the crux of his whole video. The premise of the argument is very simple. In order to actually say whether the Imperium of Man is fascist, we have to arrive at a workable definition of fascism. Once we have this, then all we have to do is see if the Imperium meets the standards of fascism, and Bob's your uncle, we have our answer. So then let's look at what definition Arch Warhammer decides is a good definition of fascism. His argument starts, like many, on Wikipedia. If we go to Wikipedia, like he does, we can see that they have an entire article dedicated to providing definitions of fascism, often from many different sources. It is noted in the article that fascism as a concept and ideology is hard to define. One key point is authoritarianism, but not every authoritarian regime is fascist, and that more qualifiers are needed. Academic Roger Griffin, in The Nature of Fascism, suggested that there is some minimum threshold of characteristics or properties that a political movement needs to take on before it becomes fascist, which will come up later. So let's follow Arch Warhammer's process to see how he ends up deciding the Imperium isn't fascist and discuss the arguments as they come up. He starts off by looking at a definition given by Italian fascist Sergio Panunzio, who believed fascism was a form of national syndicalism. Syndicalism itself is a kind of revolutionary strategy to achieve socialism, and Arch Warhammer is correct when he says that syndicalists believed in a kind of revolutionary change in society, one without states. Instead, organizations of workers called syndicates would cooperate with one another in federations. Arch Warhammer also says that Panunzio wanted to make syndicalism a part of the state, and here is our first problem. We have contradictions, you see. Syndicalism, which abhors states, cannot also exist with nationalism, which requires them. These two things are mutually exclusive. One would have to give to make room for the other, and knowing that Panunzio would later associate with Mussolini, we can infer that his nationalism would win out over his syndicalism, if it even existed at all. Arch Warhammer says Panunzio's definition is too vague, that it relies too much on syndicalism, but in actuality, Panunzio's definition is actually incoherent. It's clear that Panunzio is combining contradictory ideas together in the hopes that it will make sense, but it clearly doesn't. This is perhaps why you shouldn't take fascists at face value. He then moves on from a fascist to a scholar of fascism, the academic Umberto Eco. In particular, he brings up Eco's 14 points of fascism from the seminal essay Ur-Fascism. It's at this point where Arch Warhammer's video takes a sudden nosedive, because he just gets a lot of things wrong, and I can't tell if it's malice or ignorance. So let's unpack what he has to say about Eco's 14 points of fascism. Arch Warhammer says that Eco said that fascism could not be made into a coherent system, but that having just one of these points could coagulate into fascism. So Arch Warhammer seems to have misunderstood the Wikipedia excerpt about what Eco's points actually mean. Eco is not arguing, as Arch Warhammer believes, that any of the 14 points means that a political ideology or system is fascist. Rather, fascism is an incoherent ideology, and that rather than looking for unmovable characteristics, the heart of fascistic ideology can develop from the 14 points mentioned below. You are meant to analyze the society or political system using the points, and the more intersections you see, the more evidence you have that the underlying system is fascist. You can have both weakly fascistic and strongly fascistic outcomes, and this allows you to generalize the fascism of the real world, which is often contradictory and incoherent. Instead of looking at how the Imperium fits into these points, Arch Warhammer instead prefers to offer very weak evidence that these points are broad and meant to be general, ignoring that that is their entire purpose in the first place. Eco correctly recognized, even then, that if you try to very specifically define fascism, the fascists will just change their outward presentation until they no longer fit the definition and can escape scrutiny. After all, it is social suicide to identify as a fascist, so fascists have long been looking for ways to escape the consequences of their beliefs, for as long as those beliefs have had consequences. Let's go over the points he makes and see how silly they actually are. So point 1, Newspeak. Arch Warhammer brings up some tweets by the Glasgow Police Department about polite internet etiquette. Does he think the Glasgow Police Department are somehow run by SJWs? Or is it the case that someone on the internet told him to be nice online and he felt offended? What about this? He cites apparently the ability of SJWs to control speech through fines. He's wrong about this one too. He didn't even read the article. It clearly said that accidental misgendering isn't a crime, only deliberate malicious use of it was, i.e. targeted harassment. The same legislation protects people from the use of racial slurs. Or does Arch Warhammer think that these should be allowed too? For his second point, the fear of difference, he cites a bunch of different countries, but doesn't bother to explain just how it is that these countries have a fear of difference. Eco is referring to racism here, and in this case, racism is a big problem in many countries, and, by extension, racism has become a part of fascism. For Eco's third point, disagreement is treason, Arch Warhammer has to bring up the communist regimes here. I can't really debunk the claims he makes because he cites no evidence for them. He just says that the communists purged a bunch of people and then leaves it at that. I will say, though, that the Germans and Italians and Japanese also punished dissent within their ranks, so this seems very much a feature of authoritarianism in general, which means it can, as mentioned earlier, still be a feature of fascism. Finally, his last point is the appeal to a frustrated middle class. In Arch Warhammer's words, every politician appeals to a frustrated middle class. He again misunderstands Eco. In Eco's own words, this is why one of the most typical features of historical fascism was to appeal to a frustrated middle class, a class suffering from an economic crisis or feelings of political humiliation, and frightened by the pressure of lower social groups. This makes perfect sense if you look at the history. In Germany, Italy, and Japan, all of these nations were full of people looking desperately to recover from past humiliation dealt to them by outside powers. They underwent severe economic downturns, which were only made worse by their governments being less able to offer relief, and the fascists took this frustration and magnified it into the necessary impetus to take over. Different people can use this frustration in different ways. For the fascists, they can use racism as their scapegoat for the source of the frustration. But for socialists, they point to the system of capitalism. This is a piece of nuance Arch Warhammer is clearly missing. This is why you are meant to examine Eco's points in their totality, because looking only for a few, you'd be able to stretch them and pretend like Eco's definitions are useless. But if you took the time to examine them and actually read them, then you'd see he has a point. fascism is incoherent and lacks any real political theory like with many other ideologies. It must be hard to define so that the fascists can escape being uncovered until such time as they can enact their plans. Pretending that this isn't the case shows a poor understanding of history and how fascists have taken over. You are supposed to look at the list in totality and not pretend that there are individual markers of fascism on their own. Arch Warhammer's next stop is to disregard the definitions from communists about what they believe fascism is. This is frustrating because, of course, he was willing to hear out actual fascists about what they believe about themselves, but he's very quick to disregard the opinion of fascism's most staunch enemies, communists. There's not much to go on here, so we can skip this one. So after all of this, where does this leave us? Well, without any shred of irony, Arch Warhammer says, fascism was, from the very inception, intended to be a loose and malleable idea, one of action and realism, rather than principle or ideal. It doesn't get much more explicit than that, folks. Arch Warhammer admits that fascism is irrational and incoherent, as I've said before, and so this just reinforces what a poor reading he did of Echo's 14 points. If you needed more proof, you quote Giovanni Gentile, another fascist and figure in Mussolini's government. The quote is as follows: "Fascism is not a philosophy, much less is it a religion. It is not even a political theory, which may be stated in a series of formulae. The significance of fascism is not to be grasped in special theses, from which it time to time assumes. When on occasion it has announced a program, a goal, or concept to be realized in action, fascism has to abandon them when in practice these were found to be inadequate or inconsistent with the principles of fascism." So Arch Warhammer has finally stated what I maintained much earlier on. It doesn't get much clearer than this. So where do we go from here? Well, for Arch Warhammer, even after quoting fascists on their own incoherent ideology, he decides to take Mussolini at face value and use his principles to derive a definition of fascism, which is based on 3 principles. All within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Is this a good definition? I would argue no. It's guilty of a number of problems. What does the state exactly mean? What does it mean to be outside the state, against the state? If we go by Arch Warhammer's logic, then it's according to whatever the most powerful person at the time decides it is. But this definition could, depending on how you decide to slice the meaning of the words, be applied rather broadly. Also, as a sidebar, Arch Warhammer fails to separate the racism of fascism from fascism. He cites the loose definition of race used by Mussolini, and then also downplays the significance of specific race laws in Italy. In Germany, racism was a cornerstone of their policy. What was the final solution a response to, after all? The same for Japan, who viewed the other Asian people of the East with great disdain. He also cites the presence of Muslim or Soviet forces in the German army as an example of how loose the definition of race was for fascists, and thus that fascists were not racist, while also noting, without irony, that these concessions were made for practical wartime purposes. The ability of the state to use people it deems as inferior is just another example of how fascism is irrational. These few examples don't at all dismiss the actual institutional views these fascist nations had about race, and how they responded to various races. You can't point to a couple of army units and say the German fascists aren't obsessed with race, when at the same time they were undertaking a concentrated effort to genocide the Jewish people. This would be like pointing to a bully who is hogging a swing and going to the bathroom and thus leaving the swing occasionally as proof that the bully isn't preventing all the other children from using it, especially when they come back and take it back from the kid who was on it by force. So I think it's worthwhile to use Arch Warhammer's definition to demonstrate that the Imperium is in fact fascist. For all within the state, the Imperium of Man's practical reality is that it exists in such a vast domain that it is physically impossible to rule the Imperium all the way from Terra. Instead, imperial planets are ruled through the planetary governor system. The Imperium appoints and empowers a governor to rule for it, and to relay its actual authority with the provision that said governor can be removed, and often executed should they fail their duty to the Imperium proper. This is very much a style of feudalism, but Arch is wrong when it means that there are things outside the state. The imperial planetary governors govern as they please, but the basis for their power comes from the Imperium as a state. Why then would the Imperium demand tithes from each planet and remove governors if they fail to meet their standards, if these planets were not somehow incorporated into the state structure as a whole? By this argument, the decentralized nature of the Imperium means that it doesn't actually exist. since the state is not a single contiguous entity, despite of course it acting like one and exerting almost total control where it needs to, just like the fascists in real life did. The inability of the Imperium to exert 100% total control of 100% everything sets a standard that couldn't be met by the actual realities of the setting. 40k is expansive and ridiculous, but it still tries to present a reality, one in which fascism is reasonable. So for nothing outside the state, Arch Warhammer says the existence of something like the Mechanicus demonstrates that there are things outside the state. This is nonsense. Fascist Germany was close allies to Fascist Italy, even though Italy was a burden to Germany in the war, and the Italians turned on the Germans at the end. Using this logic, the existence of Italy in the Axis means Germany wasn't fascist, which isn't the case. Similarly, the existence of the Mechanicus doesn't show that the Imperium isn't all-encompassing. The two entities are inextricably linked, as he mentioned, by alliances and necessity, and the simple truth is that the Mechanicus is just another part of the aspect of the state that is the Imperium. Seriously ask yourself if the Mechanicus could exist without the Imperium and vice versa. No, in fact, the Emperor is just a different version of the Omnissiah who is worshipped by the Mechanicus, to drive the point further home. For the third point, nothing against the state, Arch Warhammer brings up the Ministorum and the Inquisition as examples of nothing against the state, which should be ludicrous to anyone that knows the law. The Inquisition was specifically created by the Emperor for his mandate of rooting out threats to the Imperium. It doesn't matter if the Inquisition ends up fighting against the Imperium. From their perspective, the Imperium needs to be protected from itself in accordance with the direct will of the Emperor. The Ministorum exists to propagate the will of the Emperor in whose name the Imperium exists. For example, the Space Marines have their own planets and traditions. Are they somehow against the state of the Imperium just because they don't exactly conform to its doctrines? The Imperium is, just like in real life, incoherent and contradictory as expected from the scale of the setting. For examples in real life, the Nazi High Command was infamously divided and struggled with one another to the detriment of the German state. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy fought one another for control of the country's limited resources, and they were never able to unify even as the nation actually needed them. Arch Warhammer selectively interpreted the meaning of the definition he provided without considering the wider context of the Imperium, and thus somehow failed to notice that the Imperium was fascist even by the ridiculous standards he had set for it. The argument that Arch Warhammer makes here is a simple one. He argues that the depiction of the Imperium now is different to the original days of Rogue Trader, which is fair enough. The game has evolved in several ways. However, he opines that the modern Imperium is very different to its prior iteration, and that this is enough to discredit any attempt at satire. Of course, to him, the modern Imperium fails to meet his standards for fascism, so if the earlier Imperium doesn't, then this argument would demonstrate that no standard of the Imperium would be fascist. As I will demonstrate later, the modern Imperium does meet a reasonable standard to be fascist, so I will focus here on the earlier Imperium, in the good old days of Rogue Trader. Warhammer 40k's origins are very peculiar as far as games go. As Arch Warhammer indicates, 40k comes from an earlier game called Rogue Trader. The game, primarily developed by Rick Priestley, is very different to what we might imagine Warhammer 40k is now. The game was more chaotic, free-spirited, and more of an emphasis was placed on role-playing rather than massive army combat. So to see what kind of game it was, let's look at some of the early artwork for the game. Full disclosure, I haven't actually played Rogue Trader myself, so I can't speak to exactly how representative the art is of the actual game, but I still think it's reasonably instructive. So looking at the artwork, we can see that there is some basis for the kind of game Warhammer 40k would later develop into, but there is a distinct difference between them. This isn't simply in the level of refinement of the art. Better art would have naturally come with time. No, the truly dark and gothic seriousness of 40k is not quite there. In some sense, the figures look almost comical, especially to modern audiences who are more used to our version of 40k. One particular image, which I think is rather telling, is this one. In it, you can see the prototypical Marines with their beaky helmets, who appear to be arresting a punk who was in the process of mocking them via some graffiti. I think if you wanted to know about the original authors of Rogue Trader and see what they were like, I think this image is a great one. It conjures up images of an 80s era Britain, during a time of severe economic austerity and under the ever-watchful eye of Margaret Thatcher. If we had to imagine the Imperium of this photo, even with its text, ideas of a police state come to mind, one that is definitely there to put down and suppress the free-thinking radical people. This should come as no surprise then, given that this was the reality for the youth of Britain. Now, to understand a satire, it is always helpful to be familiar with the context that the satire was created in. To Rick Priestley, Andy Chambers and their fellows, the 80s was a depressing time to be a young person in Britain. The economy was down, and the government's austerity measures imposed a grim sort of suffering, but mostly on the poor. World War II would have been almost 30 years in the past by then, and so of increasingly fading relevance to the youth, who had to deal with a new and grim reality. When creating art, people tend to draw heavily on what's around them. For the original creators at Games Workshop, this meant Thatcher's Britain, and not fascist Germany. The youth tend to rebel, and it's no wonder then that a counterculture developed to make fun of the Iron Lady and her government. Her government, which would have been the new form of fascism as opposed to the old form of fascism in the 40s. The youth tend to rebel, and it's no wonder then that a counterculture developed to make fun of the Iron Lady and her government. And her government, which would have been the new form of fascism as opposed to the old form of fascism in the 40s, was like a chimera. What had become overt and direct had morphed into a more subtle and disguised form. British fascists, and they did exist even in World War II, became British nationalists. Racism became a matter of identitarianism, and Britain's government came more and more in policy to resemble their former arch-enemy, though by far and away a much lighter shade of it. As mentioned, it's entirely possible for a society to be weakly fascist, in transition towards a true fascism, and Britain in the 80s is an interesting candidate for it. As time went on and the original team gave way to new writers, and the game's requirements grew, and the newer generation of authors would change in their inspirations and motives. I genuinely believe that Rick Priestley and the gang were trying to satirize the Britain that they grew up with through the game that they were making, but I also think that over time and through accretion, the clarity of this satire has gotten lost in the grim darkness of 40k. After all, satires don't tend to sell too well to people who can't get them, and the audience of Warhammer 40k has decidedly moved away from any pretensions to being working class. As a satire of fascism, I think 40k can reasonably work well. For reasons outlined earlier, the world of 40k is so thoroughly absurd that fascism seems reasonable. This, to some, would be enough to make fun of it, since fascism often tends to live in an absurd reality, especially given the beliefs that fascists have. But for others, especially those who aren't well read, it might simply read as a very dark sci-fi setting, and it can fly over their heads. As a last aside, Arch Warhammer mentions that Gazkul can be taken as a satire of Thatcher. According to Andy Chambers, Gazkul was actually derived from their role-playing language. Although if we had to look, an all-powerful society-destroying tyrant wouldn't be too far from what Thatcher would look like, especially from the perspective of a poor person. To a poor person, Margaret, there is no society, Thatcher, presided over one of the most comprehensive destructions of British public service in history. It's possible for it to be a satire of Thatcher, but it's also possible to be nonsense and the tale is apocryphal. With the discussion of why Arch Warhammer's analysis is wrong, and in some cases misleading, it is now time to actually look at the question, but this time through a better framework for understanding fascism, specifically Echo's 14 points. So the reason why Echo formulated his points is to demonstrate that when dealing with as incoherent and dishonest an ideology as fascism, you have to look at a conjunction of things in their context. You are meant to look at the points together to establish in the political and social context whether or not, by the sum being greater than their parts, if fascism has emerged. One or even 2 points alone is not enough to establish whether or not you have a fascist society. You must look at the entire list in context. We know from history that Italian fascism was different to German fascism, which was different to Japanese fascism, and yet, if you apply Echo's points to these places and do an honest study, you emerge with the conclusion that they were fascist. So now, let us apply the points to the Imperium of Man to see how well the Imperium as a whole fits under them. How would 40,000 years into the future change how we think of fascism and see it? So for Echo's first point, the culture of tradition, we have to see that the Imperium of Man is defined by tradition. Every facet of imperial society as a whole is bound by the traditions that have been laid down and passed on for millennia. You can see this from the legions of scribes in the Administratum who have to toil away writing documents whose purpose that they don't even know, or the rituals and traditions that cannot be removed from the Mechanicus and how they operate and view technology. Even the Space Marines, the sons of the Emperor, some of whom are so bound by tradition, like the Ultramarines, that to go against the word of tradition, the Codex Astartes, is to invite death. Echo's second point is the rejection of modernism. Well, the Imperium resoundingly rejects modernism. Everything about them has to reject it. Their society rejects any attempts at technological or social progress. The Imperium's planets are so fundamentally meant to oppose attempts to change them that the laws remain unchanging for hundreds to thousands of years. The people on these planets are raised to reject all notions of reason, liberty, and equality, which are the foundations of Enlightenment thinking and modernism as a whole. Echo's third point is the cult of action for action's sake. In his own words, action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation. How can we look upon the Imperium, whose first instincts are to destroy whatever they can, as anything but acting for the sake of action? There is no room in the Imperium for thinking, no time to reflect. There is only time for moving from one disaster to another, fighting desperately each day for survival. Echo's fourth point is disagreement is treason. This one should be obvious. Everyone who plays 40k would have heard the endless heresy blam jokes. There's no room in the Imperium for dissent. There are legions of agents and mechanisms in Imperial society dedicated to quashing dissent, of any kind, with the harshest punishments available for the smallest infractions. Echo's fifth point is the fear of difference. This is another easy one. The Imperium is outright xenophobic. It is one of the most extreme examples of xenophobia that we can find in fiction. The Imperium makes no pretenses about their hatred for the alien, the mutant, and the heretic. It should be abundantly clear to all those with reason that the Imperium as we see it in 40k is built on the fear of difference. Their society simply cannot allow for any kind of deviance from the norm, otherwise it would fall apart, just like in fascist societies. Echo's sixth point is the appeal to social frustration. This is the first one where the Imperium does not actually meet the criteria, or at least not directly. This is not because there is no social frustration in society, but rather because Imperial society as a whole does not have the same kind of social classes we look at in today's society. The majority of people in the Imperium would be servants of one kind or another, ruled over by overseers in increasingly complex bureaucratic institutions. There is no need to appeal to social frustration because the Imperial's rule is, as far as they can see, already absolute. Echo's seventh point is the obsession with a plot. Again, to use his own words, the followers must feel besieged. The easiest way to solve the plot is the appeal to xenophobia. This should be extremely clear. The Imperium is besieged, both physically and psychologically, in its position in the galaxy. Imperial society is structured such that it must always be internally vigilant for any sign of deviance, and always obsessed with the plotting of its enemies against itself. Echo's eighth point is the enemy is both strong and weak. A common trick used by fascists is this double state. Remember how Arch described the SJWs? Well, he sees them as simultaneously being able to control society, and it at the same time derisively mocks them for their weakness. Well, the Imperial has the same perception. The enemies they face are simultaneously the ruin of the Imperium, and yet the might of the Imperium dwarfs their enemies. To be an Imperial citizen is to live with the seemingly baffling state of affairs. For example, the Orcs are an existential threat to the Imperium, and yet, whenever Orcs are mentioned, especially in the Imperial codices, the forces of the Imperium would mightily triumph over them. Echo's ninth point is pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. Realistically, if you look at the lore of the Imperium and their history, you see that they prefer violence over peace, war over diplomacy, and this has been a current theme throughout even modern 40k. The tagline of the game is literally, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. I feel I shouldn't have to say this, but a game like 40k would never produce a lore where there's room for pacifism. The Imperium in lore brooks no tolerance for those that will not fight in its endless wars. Echo's 10th point is contempt for the weak. The Imperium of Man has an idolation of strength. Everything we get about them shows how much they value strength and belittle weakness. Imperial society shuns the mutated and the deformed, and their elite warriors in society are literally genetically engineered and conditioned to be ultimate warriors. Soldiers like the Space Marines are the embodiment of what fascists would have wanted to create, genetically perfect super soldiers. Echo's 11th point is everyone is educated to become a hero. His words are very instructive here. In Ur-Fascist ideology, heroism is the norm. This cult of heroism is strictly linked with the cult of death. I shouldn't have to bring up that the Imperium literally has death cults, but everyone's probably heard of that quote, "The blood of martyrs is the seed of the Imperium." Everything about imperial society is built so that every citizen is conditioned to sacrifice and die for the Imperium as a whole. No one person is above the Imperium, and the Imperium is above all. Echo's 12th point is Machismo and Weaponry. Warhammer 40k is remarkably sexless, no doubt as a way to keep selling miniatures to younger people, even in a setting which has a literal god of pleasure. There's something distinctly funny to me that the ultra-macho Space Marines are typically depicted as being chaste, and ultra-brotherly with one another. But this should be obvious. The Imperium of Man is obsessed with weaponry. The entire setting is obsessed with weaponry. Everything is about warfare and violence. And to be a man, to be a powerful man, is to be a powerful warrior in imperial society. Echo's 13th point is selective populism. The Imperium is a deeply stratified society. There's a great mass of ordinary citizens who have no power or control, and then there's a mass and complex hierarchy of individuals who sit somewhere above them. These people, the ruling class in imperial society, is for whom selective populism applies. These people, more than the workers, are the ones who dictate the actual voice of the people. Whenever the Imperium thinks or speaks, it is done through them, the small percentage of actual speakers who run imperial society. And now we get to the last point, and the one that Arch Warhammer brought up first. Ur-Fascism speaks Newspeak. Well, I'd like to ask you, which do you think is more likely? That every imperial citizen gets a rounded and expansive education to think and express themselves critically? Or does the Imperium treat each person as an expendable cog in its vast machinery, allowing everyone only so much knowledge as they need to be useful and not an iota more? It should obviously be the latter. So looking here, the Imperium has at least 13 of the 14 points of Echo's fascism. I wonder why Arch deliberately avoided looking at the Imperium from these points, using the analytical method proposed by Echo in the first place. It's not just that the Imperium hits a number of checkboxes in a list. What's important is that the Imperium demonstrates to us, the audience, a massively interconnected web of these characteristics. It is supremely xenophobic and extremely paranoid of difference. It is obsessed with its power, but also facing terminal decline. Imperial society is at a contradiction with itself, seemingly infinitely powerful and yet destined to be destroyed. These are all the characteristics you'd expect to see of a fascist state, and the Imperium is strongly like this. And importantly, there is a point to this. The Imperium is designed to be this way by Games Workshop. The universe and setting of Warhammer 40k is designed to be so bleak and so awful that only in this insanity of a reality could fascism be the utilitarian proposition. Arch Warhammer is so incredibly dense that he mentions that the Imperium is a xenophobic, theocratic, or authoritarian state, and then pretends like there's absolutely no more to the analysis than that. The Imperium is fascist because the world it is in is so insane, so unreasonable, that to be anything else would be to invite disaster. One would think then, if one were capable of being reflective about media, that the point of this is to demonstrate a satire of fascism. Fascism only makes sense in a world gone insane, and there are no worlds more insane than the grim reality of Warhammer 40k. With the main points examined, I'd like to quickly talk about some small points raised by Arch Warhammer that didn't make the cut for an actual segment. Arch Warhammer doesn't really present much evidence for his claims, so I'd still be wary of taking him at face value. Most of these points aren't all that coherent on their own, so the focus of this segment will be to go over them quickly, explain why they're wrong, and possibly link to other videos for deeper analysis. So firstly, Arch Warhammer said that the Emperor is not a dictator because he delegated control heavily when he was alive, and he only vaguely commands the Imperium now that he is on life support. This is nonsense. Does Arch Warhammer think Hitler personally made every single choice that had to be made in Germany? Or actually, would he delegate command and control to subordinates like Göring, for example? The Emperor can still rule with total authority, even if he decides that he doesn't need to make every single decision. It's all in his name. Even being on life support doesn't change this fact. The mechanisms that perpetuate the will of the Emperor don't actually need him to be alive and directly in command, such as the system of the High Lords of Terra, but directly in command because he was crippled by Horus. Because some line of authority can still be drawn directly from the agents of the Imperium to the Emperor and his actions. Arch Warhammer takes fascists at their word very easily. He doesn't trust academics or scholars much on fascism, but he does seem to take the words of fascists at face value, which isn't something one should do very often. It would be better to look at the actions of fascists rather than their words, since they tend to lie. I have linked to a video by 3 Arrows which explains the process by which German society became cruel. for a better explanation of why you shouldn't trust fascists at face value. Arch Warhammer suggests that fascists are somehow in opposition to capitalists, even citing Hitler on this. This is, well, wrong, given what we know about fascist regimes. They allow for private enterprise, they tend to kill all the socialists that oppose them, and so on. Fascism is more like capitalism with its hierarchy than socialism is, but I'll direct you to a video by Kay and Skittles for an understanding of how fascism actually emerges from capitalism rather than, say, from socialism. Another common problem with Arch Warhammer's thinking is that he assumes that because many fascists were formerly socialist, that fascism and socialism are somehow related. He even brings up the hatred fascists have for socialists with no sense of irony whatsoever. I could, heaven forbid, be a supporter of Chelsea Football Club and then decide to switch over to Liverpool. Does this then mean that the two clubs are actually anything alike? No. It's entirely possible for people to adopt radically different positions in their lives for reasons that have nothing to do with their principles. So I've linked to another video by 3 Arrows that debunks the idea that socialism and fascism are interlinked. Arch Warhammer is just lying when he says Mussolini only concerned himself with Italy. Mussolini specifically wanted to rebuild the old Roman Empire, and that's why the Italians got involved in Ethiopia in the first place. Finally, Arch Warhammer thinks that the prevalence of overt racism back in their day somehow makes the racism of fascism less distinctive. I'd like to remind him that the German fascists got their eugenics program from the US eugenics movement, and that to non-white people in the US, the slavery and genocide of the US would very much make the US a fascist state. This only reinforces how critical racism is to fascism. A fundamental part of why Arch Warhammer's analysis is bad is because he resorts to something called the Thermian Argument. I've linked to a video by Folding Ideas for a thorough explanation of it, but essentially, the Thermian Argument is an argument of, because the writers said so, therefore the criticism is invalid. If you are trying to criticize something bad in a piece of media, and someone tries to dismiss your criticism by saying the writers justified the bad thing inside the text of the media, then you've encountered the Thermian Argument. Warhammer 40k is a great example. The creators built a world in which fascism is seen as the only reasonable way to survive the setting, and yet, they didn't have to do this. No one was forcing them to write the grimdark reality of 40k. This choice of theirs doesn't shield them from us questioning the nature of the Imperium. If the Imperium must be fascist to survive 40k, then we have to ask, why was 40k made this way? Using the Thermian Argument to dismiss this concern is lazy and avoids any potential value that could be had from exploring this concept. And here I thought it was only the Inquisition that suppressed knowledge about 40k. One reason to explain why 40k is the way that it is probably just financial. Games Workshop needs the setting to enable them to keep selling models, so they invented a place where the Imperium is stuck in a state of perpetual war with no hope of peace or relief. By necessity, the Imperium in this reality has to be fascist, for them to have even a shred of plausibility. Arch Warhammer said it himself, there's no way democracy could function on the scale that the Imperium operates on in the universe that it does. Another reason, though probably more true of the earlier Games Workshop than now, is that the writers wanted to construct a setting where fascism is reasonable, and so wrote an absurd universe that can't possibly be more dark and edgy than if it tried. For people in reality, this setting could be satirical because it makes fun of the kind of belief that underlies fascism in the first place, namely that the early fascists are fighting for the desperate survival of their people while surrounded on all sides by alien foes with whom there can be no peace. There's no reason for this in the text to justify the setting of Warhammer 40k to be the way that it is, but it definitely does make for a compelling setting to justify selling a lot of miniatures. Arch Warhammer simply can't pretend like we got 40k delivered to us by the gods above, and that we can't question it or analyze it further. That's something the Imperium would do, and last time I checked, they were the bad guys. So you might be wondering, why does this matter? Why does it matter if the Imperium is fascist or not? Can't I just play the game and not think about that? Well, sure you can. I definitely won't stop you. To be honest, the stakes are really low on this one. Warhammer 40k is a tabletop wargame. There are definitely far more important things in the world, and yet I care about it, and I care about it deeply. Wargaming is an important part of my life, and I want it to be better. But if it can't be better, if the fans of the community aren't encouraged to really think about it critically or seriously, If we are only meant to consume Warhammer as a product, then it will never get better because it has no reason to improve. It will only stagnate and get worse over time, much like the Imperium. So welcome to anyone who is still watching this at the end. I'm glad you stuck around to see what a train wreck of ideas Arch Warhammer's opinions turned out to be. In summary, the Imperium is fascist, but made that way by design, either as a satire of fascism and its absurd worldview, or as a necessary choice to create a more profitable setting. Perhaps some combination of both. Late capitalism is strange that way, but if Warhammer is to get better, it's the kind of question we have to seriously interrogate. This video took a while to produce, not least because the subject video is over 50 minutes long, and it is my first response video, so if you guys like it, I might produce more. Perhaps give suggestions of what you'd like to see in the comments below. Give the video a like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. I appreciate you guys. Take care.